All right, so everyone, welcome to today's session. Today's session is creating sessions with Zoom Video SDK for the web. And this is hosted by Zoom for developers and the developer advocacy team here at Zoom. And today we're going to code alongside our esteemed colleague, Rehema Armorer, or Rehema Jobs, as she's got her turtleneck on today. So it's very, very Apple-esque. It's great. So yeah, today we're going to go through and she's going to show you how to do Video SDK for the web with sessions and authentication and getting started with that. So take it away, Rehema.
All right, thanks so much, Kelly, for that introduction. I appreciate it. So like Kelly said, we're going to go ahead and walk through getting started with the Video SDK. Before we begin, we're just going to go over our learning goals and also check in on some prerequisites that we had for this workshop. So I just want to preface and say, if you see me looking this way, I'm looking at my external monitor. Just want to preface that. So let's go ahead and just go over some learning goals. So with this workshop, you're going to be able to access your Video SDK credentials and understand how to use them within your application. You're also going to know how to generate your JWT or JOT token and where you should do that within the application as well. We'll go over initializing and destroying your session, joining and leaving your session, and you'll see how to incorporate an event listener into your application. So this is what we will be doing today. And I do just want to say that you can look forward to video and audio implementation in future workshops. We won't touch on that today, but it is something to look forward to in future workshops. All right, so I did just go over these learning goals, but now they are on the screen and you should be able to see them. So I'm going to give us a few seconds to look these over. These are what I just said aloud. And then again, I'll mention at the bottom, we have an asterisk just telling us that we'll do video and audio implementation at a later time. But right now we're going to go over initializing and joining our sessions. So this repository was sent out prior to this workshop, and it was included so that you can clone and you could clone this repository and bring it onto your system. So if you have not done that, we'll go ahead and drop the link into and you do that now. All right, so I just dropped the link and then it's there, so you can go ahead and clone that and get that onto your system. And while you're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and just look at our prerequisites. So as I mentioned before, this was sent out ahead of time, but you should have a code editor set up and ready on your system. I'll be using VS Code. You can use the one of your choice. You should also have the latest version of Node available on your system. So anything 16 or Node.js 16 or higher should be good to go. Again, you want this repo downloaded and cloned, and you also want an active Video SDK account. All right, so I'm going to give us a few seconds to go ahead and clone this repository if we need it, checking the chat as well. And then I'm going to go ahead and jump into walking through getting those Video SDK credentials.
Rehema, it looks like there's a question. If you haven't been able to get the Video SDK in your develop dropdown in the marketplace, maybe we'll call that out.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So if you're not seeing, let's go ahead and just jump there now. So on the marketplace webpage or on the site, you should be able to sign in. So first, make sure that you are signed in with your Video SDK specific account. So if I go here, I am signed in with the wrong account. So let me sign out. And then I want to sign in with my account that is specific for the Video SDK. So when working with the Video SDK, you do need a separate account that is specific to this part of the platform. So mine is very simple, .dev.video SDK, but I am signing in with a specific account. So you do need to have this plan set up for you to see that that build Video SDK dropdown under develop. If you're able to, B. Williams, I know that was an issue you were having. I see that you're saying you still don't have it. You could just let us know in the chat, do you have a Video SDK account set up? All right, so while we're waiting on that answer, just want to say it again. You need to have the Video SDK account set up to work with this part of the platform. If you're checking to see if you can log into that account that you have, go ahead and do that. I'm going to give us a few more seconds to make sure we have that up and running, and then I'm going to jump into finding those credentials. All right, so now I am going to go ahead and just click on this develop dropdown, and I'm going to select build Video SDK. Now I know at least one person has mentioned still being unable to access this. So if you're unable to access it at this point, just go ahead and follow along, and that can be something we look into at the end. All right, so once you pull up the Build Video SDK, you're going to be brought to this page. It would look just like this. Only difference is your app name may be different. I just named mine quickly on the fly. So you'll fill in some information. And then on this page, once you scroll down, you're going to see a section titled SDK Credentials. So under SDK Credentials, you'll be able to get your SDK key and your SDK secret. So I'm not scrolling down right now just to keep my private information private, but again, that's going to be your SDK key and your SDK secret, and you are going to need those for building and working with the Video SDK. All right, so we have gained our credentials. I'm going to scroll down again and just show what that looks like. So SDK key, SDK secret. You can go ahead, and if you want to now, you can copy those into a notes application on your computer to save those. We'll be inputting those a few steps ahead. All right, so now that we've gotten our credentials, we are going to go ahead and jump into our code editor. Again, I'm going to be using VS Code. All right, so now that we are inside of our code editor, what we're going to do first is make sure we install all the packages that we need. So I'm going to open a new terminal, and you'll also see these notes inside of our README. So I'll open this up right here. The first thing we want to do, we have two separate folders inside of our master folder. We have the client folder for our front end files, and we have our server folder for our backend files. So what we want to do is make sure we install all the packages we need for each of these separate folders. So the first thing I'm going to do inside of my terminal, that should be already directed into our workshop project. Again, you're going to get this after you fork and clone the repo. So fork, clone, and open up that repo, and then you're opening up a terminal. And now inside our terminal, we want to go into first our server folder. So you run this command cd server. You're also going to see that inside of your README. You can copy and paste it from there as well. And then once you're in that folder, you want to go ahead and run the command npm install. So now we'll go ahead and continue. And I do just want to pause before we run that npm install, or if you've already run it, that's fine. But I do just want to jump into our README back out of VS Code. And I want to just review how this workshop is going to be broken down. So you should be seeing on your screen right now, there's a section in our README titled branches/sections. Kelly, could you just give me a thumbs up that we're seeing the GitHub page?
Yes, we are, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right, so this workshop is divided into sections in a way. So each section, at the end of it, we're going to go over a number of points and make sure that we've completed what we set out to do. So for example, you'll see step 1, it's telling us what we're going to do, create our front end and some middleware functionality. At the end of step 1, I'm going to make sure that I've completed all these steps. And if at any time at the end of a step, you feel as though you've fallen behind or you haven't completed each of these bullet points, what you can do is run the command git checkout step, and then you can go to the step that we've just completed. So if, for instance, at the end of step 1, after we have gone over all these different points and said that they've been completed and added to our code, if any of them haven't been done, you can go ahead and run git checkout step _1. So that's an underscore step _1. And that's going to push you to the completed step 1 and put you at the same place that I'll be at when we're coding. That way you won't have anything missing. So again, it's divided out into sections. Each section has a different branch, and you can jump to that branch at the end if you ever feel like you've fallen behind. All right, so just went over how this workshop is broken up into our different sections and our branches. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and jump to step 0. So I will copy this command into the chat, but I'm going to go ahead and check out to step 0, and that's where I'll be building from. So in the README, you'll see that it tells us that the master branch has the whole project completed. We want to work alongside and code it out together. So let's go ahead and all check out to step 0. Let me add this into the chat. So you can run this command inside of your terminal. And then you want to make sure if you're still directed into your server folder, you'll want to jump out of that folder back into the main workshop project and run this command. So I'll give us a few seconds to go ahead and get on to step 0. All right, so now that we're on the initial step, we can go ahead. I'm going to open a new terminal, and then we're going to run those same commands. So cd into your server folder. And then I'm not going to run an npm install. I do have my packages installed, but you'll need to do that if you're this is your first time for forking and cloning and working with this repository. For easy management, I'm going to open a second terminal, and this will be my front end or client terminal. So I'm going to run the command cd client, which again is inside of our README. And then I'm just going to jump into my client folder. So I'll give us a few seconds. What we're doing now, again, is we are installing all of our packages on the front end of our project inside our client folder and on the back end inside of our server folder. And again, we are starting on step 0. All right, so now we are going to continue on. I do want to just point something out that while we're working with this project, if you need to, if you make any changes to your server and you want to see those changes reflected within your application, you will need to quit your terminal, and you can do, or quit your server terminal. Sorry, you'll quit your server terminal, and then from there, you'll just restart it. So you'll hold down Control-C to quit the terminal, and then you'll run node server just to restart your terminal. And these commands, again, are inside of our README. So just pointing out that there's no hot reload for the server. If you make a change and you want to see reflected, you'll destroy your server terminal, and then you'll restart it. All right, so we should be good to go. Working on step 0, we have our server terminal and our client terminal. We should have all of our packages installed. With that, we should be up to date on the latest version of each package that we'll be using. So now we're going to go ahead and start with our index.js file and begin coding. So everyone should be able to go ahead and jump into index.js, and it should look just like what you see on my screen. Again, we are on index.js. So here we're going to go ahead, and the first thing we want to do, the hand up confused me. The first thing that we want to do is create our client, and the client is going to be a variable that will store, and this is going to allow us to manipulate the video SDK. The video SDK in any way that we need to. So it'll allow us to gain access to media, to audio, video streaming, and anything else that we need with it. This is also what allows us to join and initialize sessions. So you'll notice on line 6 that we've imported in our Zoom video, and this is from the installed Zoom Video SDK package. So what we want to do now is create a variable called client, and we want to save it to the output of invoking the create client function on our imported in Zoom video. So you should have online. I have it on line 10. I'm actually going to move it up, and I want to see it on line 8. So your index.js should look something like this now. All right, so we've created our client. Another thing that we need to do is make sure that we can access this client throughout our application. To make sure that we can access the client and any other values or pieces of state that we need through our application, I'm taking advantage of the context API from React. So context API allows us to pass different values down by using the provider method. So we can drop in some documentation on context API at a later point, but I do want to point out that 1, this is what we're using, and 2, I've already gone ahead and created my context. You'll see there's a context folder inside of our source folder. And then you'll see there's a file global context. I've created a client context that I'll use throughout this project. And I've also created a user context that I will use throughout this project. So I'm going to go ahead and jump back into index.js. And in here, I'm highlighting line 5 to show you that we've already imported our client context that we will be using in this file. So this is already done for you. It's a part of some boilerplate that was already written into the step 0 branch. So we're good to go ahead and make use of that. So what I need to do to make sure that I can use my context API is wrap my application that's being rendered on line 15. I need to wrap this inside of a provider. I'm going to be using my client context called the provider method. And then I'm going to pass through a value that's going to be passed down into my application that's being rendered. So this value is going to be our client variable that we created. Next thing I need to do is go ahead and just close out this wrapper. All right, so your index.js should look something like this at this point. I'll just go ahead and save that page, and I'm going to pause here for any questions we may have on this step. All right, so now what we're going to do once we've saved this page, we're going to actually jump into our app.js page. So inside of app.js, what we want to do is just make sure that we have, we're going to highlight and look at this meeting arguments object that we have right here. So I just want to go over what this object will be used for. Again, it's already coded in for you. It was a part of some boilerplate code added to step 0. But this meeting arguments object is what we're going to use to go ahead and join our sessions. So it has values like our topic. We're going to fill in the name. We'll also fill in the password. And then we also have role type. So role type, you'll see a note that this is fixed for our demo. And this is a role type has 2 different values that it can take in. One is going to set you up as the host of the session, and a role type value of 0 is going to set you up as just an attendee and not a host. So for this demo, we're all going to be initializing and then joining our session as host. But again, I do just want to point out it's hard-coded for the demo, and it's hard-coded set to the value of 1 for host. All right. So the next thing that we want to do, we're going to go ahead and actually jump out of app.js. We'll come back in here in a second. But the next thing we want to do is jump into home.js. Make sure everybody is there. All right, so inside of home.js, we're going to do a few different things. The first one that we want to do is grab our client value that we pass down using the context provider on index.js. We want to make sure that we can actually use this inside other files. So to do so, we're going to make use of the use context hook. So use context is a hook from React that allows us to grab those values that were passed down with the provider method. I have to specify which context that I want to use. And because we pass down our value of client inside the client context provider, that's going to be the one that I pass into the use context hook on home.js. So we've created that value, and now we can manipulate and work with our client on home.js. Another thing that we'll notice, I should have mentioned this before, but just looking at lines 9 and 10, we're making use of the use state hook. So use state is going to allow us to update our username and update our password. If we open up lines 14 and down, we're going to see that we have some UI that was already written for you. So this UI is essentially just a login box. Our application is going to show us logging into an application, and then it's also going to show a join session button and a leave session button. So this UI on this page is just creating our login page. What we will notice on line 39 is that we're updating our username, and this is allowing us to grab it from the input that we get from the user. And then we'll see the same thing on lines 52. We're updating our password, and this is, again, allowing us to get that input from what's been inputted on the user side. So then when we come back up, we'll see that these are the functions that we're using, so we can grab the username and password and save those as pieces of state. So the next thing that I need to do on this page is gain use of my meeting arguments object. So I'm going to go ahead and create an object, create a variable called meeting args. I'm going to save that to the output of using the use context hook, and I'm going to use it on user context. So as I've completed this step, I am remembering something that I forgot to do on app.js. So I'm going to save this right now in home.js, and then I'm going to jump back into app.js. And what I need to do here is make sure that I have access to this meeting arguments object inside of different components. So to do that, I'm going to make use again of the context API, and I'm going to pass down this value inside of a provider wrapper. So in this case, I'm going to be using my user context. You'll notice on line 2 that that's been imported in. So we're going to do something very similar to what we did on index.js. And then we need to pass in our value, which is going to be the object meeting args. And then we also just need to close this out. So now anything that's being rendered onto our application is going to have access to the value meeting args. To make sure that home.js has access to it, what we're going to do is just pass in home.js inside of our rendered components inside the app component right here. So what I'm going to do is create my route. I'm going to add the path. Now this is our home page, so the path is going to be just directing us to the home page. There's not going to be any path after the /. And then we're going to pass in our element, which is going to be our imported home component. So we'll notice, let me close this out. We'll notice at the top here on line 4, we pulled in our created home component and imported onto app. That way we can pass it in as an element on line 21 here and make sure that we can access it at this path. And then also make sure that it has access to the value meeting args. Again, we'll be using the meeting arguments object to join our sessions. So I want to pause here and see if there are any questions. Just a quick overview or quick recap. We added in our meeting arguments value to a provider. And then back on home.js, we brought in these 2 variables. All right. No questions so far. So now we're going to go ahead and keep going on building out home.js. So again, home.js is where we have that login page. So we need to build in some functionality to work with that. So what we want to do next is add in one more variable. And this variable is going to be involved with the React Router DOM package that we have. So React Router DOM is how we navigate easily from different components using this React application. And there's a hook that comes from React Router DOM, and that's use and navigate. So I'm going to make we're going to make use of use navigate later. We're just going to save it to another variable called navigate, and we'll invoke that later on. We're just creating it at the top, so it's good to go. I'm going to jump back into home.js, and now I'm going to build out some functionality so that when we get user data that's submitted, we can go ahead and actually submit that data and work with it to send it to our backend, because again, we do have a server side of this project and we will be working with that. So I'm creating a function called submit user data. And it looks like this. Now, submit user data is going to have is going to be an asynchronous function. So I'm going to go ahead and add in my first keyword. And then inside this function, what we're going to do is make sure that we save the submitted username and the submitted password to our meeting arguments object. And then we're also going to create the functionality to send that information to the backend to generate our JOT token. So I'll just quickly go over the fact that we are generating our JOT token on the server side of our application. And this is for security reasons. We want to make sure that we're keeping all that sensitive data secure. So we will be sending what we get from the front end, the username and the user password, and we'll be sending that to the back end for use in generating our JOT token. And we'll be going over what that looks like in more detail in a few more steps, but I just wanted to point that out as we create this function.
Hey, Rehema, real quick. they should expect some sort of like ID warning if navigate is declared and not used, correct?
Yeah, that's no problem. We'll be using it in a little while. Thanks for pointing that out. All right, so inside of submit user data, like I mentioned, the first thing we want to do is save the submitted or save the inputted username and save the inputted password. So I'm going to add a value, or I'm sorry, access the value name inside of my meeting arguments object. And I'm going to save that to the username that's been the username that's this piece of state right here. Again, we ran update username on lines 46. This is code that was already written for you. And once we run that function, the input is going to be saved to the piece of state username. Then we're saving that username to our meeting arguments object. Now we're going to do the same thing with the password, saving it to this updated piece of state right here. All right, so we are still inside of our submit user data function. It's going to do a few more things. Next thing we want to do is create our request options object. So like I mentioned before, we are sending some information to the backend. And to do that, we're going to be making a post request. When we make post requests, we need to we're going to have a request options object. So inside of here, we have some standard values to fill in. Our method is post, right? Our headers. I'm going to copy this line for ease. And I'll also send this into the chat.
Thanks.
Someone kindly pointed out that on line 19, you have missing R and args.
Thank you so much. Thank you. All right, so let me go ahead and just add this one to the, actually, I'm going to complete all of request objects and then I will copy that into the chat. So again, if you're with us live, you'll see this in the chat. Let me go ahead and just add the last line. So a last line is going to be our body. We're going to stringify our meeting arguments object. Make sure we have our R in there. And now I'm going to go ahead and just copy this into the chat if you're following along live, and you can copy and paste it into your home.js file. So that's our request options object. And again, this is still inside of the submit user data, or yeah, submit user data function. All right, so the next thing that we want to do is save the response that we get from our fetch call. So again, this is an asynchronous function. And so we're going to be making this request to the backend. I paused here to point out that we are making use of a proxy with this application. So the proxy was already added in for you inside of your client package.json file, but our proxy is going to be on localhost 4000.
Hey, Rehema, on line 13, thank you, Alan. On line 13, do we want to do that meeting args?
And these typos, thank you so much, everybody. It's a team effort. All right, so got these typos corrected. Make sure if you also made some typos like me, to fix those, we can do a quick scan. And now I'm going to go ahead and jump back onto line 27, and I am just writing out the endpoint that we are making our fetch call to. And I will copy this into the chat. Again, if you're following along live, you can just copy it from there. All right, so that's going to be the URL or the path that we're making our call to, our post request to. And then the second parameter we're going to pass in is going to be our request options. So far, line 27 should look like this. So the next thing we're going to do is we want to add a then statement to this fetch call because it is a promise. So we're going to take the what we get back from the fetch call, JSONify it. So let's go ahead and call that method. So right now, line 27 should look like this. We're saving the output of making our fetch call. Our fetch call is going to localhost 4000/generate. We're also passing through our request options. Let me make sure there are no typos there. And then we have a then statement to handle the output and save it. So what's being saved to response right here is the JSONified version of what we got back from the server side after making this fetch request. All right, so after we've gone ahead and completed line 27, or whatever line you're on, for me, it's line 27, we saved our response. The next thing that we want to do is add this response to our meeting arguments, because this response is going to be our generated signature. So we have meeting args. We're going to add a signature property. And that's going to be set equal to response, the variable that we just created and saved on the line above. All right, so we have made that fetch request. The last thing that we're going to do inside of submit user data is going to be to initialize our video SDK session. So we're doing this inside of this function because this is going to allow the user, as soon as they log in, and because we're logging in as hosts, we can initialize our session. So I'm going to be calling a function, the init function, on my client. So for me, line 30, but your next line should look like this so far. And now inside of init, I'm going to pass through 2 of the necessary parameters. Now the first parameter is going to be the language that we'll be using. In this case, it's going to be US English. And the next parameter is going to be the path for our dependent assets. So using CDN is going to default to using the path that Zoom provides for us. You can see more about that in our documentation, which is there's a link to that at the end of our README. So for now, we're going to pass through CDN to default to the storage path that Zoom provides for us. So your init function should look like this. We're calling it on our client, and we're passing through these 2 necessary parameters. All right, so we're going to go ahead and add in a then statement as well. Create a function inside of here. So what we're going to do, just for, no, this isn't absolutely necessary, I'm going to add this line in, but just so I know the session initialize, I'm going to add a console log, and just inside the browser, inside the console, I'll see a message session initialize. So this is just for me, for my reassurance, I can know that everything is worked out. I'll get this message. And the next thing we want to do, so now we're making use of this navigate variable that we saved at the top. We're going to go ahead and push our user to their session page. And if we have any errors, we'll add in a catch statement. We'll just take that error and we'll also send that to the console. All right, so you should have a function called, or the function init should be called, and it should look like this right here. My lines 30 through 35. At this point, we are at the end of our function submit user data. So I'll highlight it. It should look like this. We're saving some variables to our meeting arguments object. We are making a fetch request and then saving the output of that to our meeting arguments object. And then we are finally initializing the session. If it's successful, we're pushing to our / session page. And if it's not, we are going to send that error to the console for the user to see. And then I just want to point out quickly that this application, this has a very simple login, so not sophisticated for demonstration purposes. But if you were using this within your own application, you would want to make sure to check those user credentials against the database and make sure that everyone's logging in properly before pushing them to the session or whatever next page they need to go to. Man, oh my goodness, thank you.
It's the live demo.
So now we're going to go ahead. We have finished out with submit user data. Let's go ahead and just save this page. And now the next thing that we're going to do is jump onto our server side. And now I'm going to open up the first file that we'll be looking at.
We still are on branch step 1, I believe, right?
Well, yes, we're still on.
Yep. So if you've fallen behind, you will be able to catch up.
All right. So inside of our server file, the first file that I'm going to point out to us is going to be server.js. Now this is entirely filled out, so just pointing that out. One, we're making use of Express for ease in writing middleware. So we'll see that pulled in on line 1 and line 2, where we save it to our app. I'm also making any calls that I need through my router.js file. So I'm also pulling this in on line 3. Then we have some standard code here, making sure that we are JSONifying anything that comes in, making use of cores. And then on lines 10 through 19, we're going to have some global error handling as well. And as Alan mentioned prior, we are setting up our port on lines 21. This is already done for you, but we are calling the listen method, passing in port 4000 so that we are good to go there. So server.js has been typed out for us, but I just want to go over brief and quick overview of what's happening. And then I do also want to point out that you should have, and if you don't, you're going to create a .env file inside of your server folder. So what you want to do is you can create that file however you want. You can use the touch command inside of your terminal, or you can go ahead and just right-click server and click new file. What we're going to do here is create a .env file, and this is where we're going to make use of that SDK key and SDK secret. So for demonstration purposes, I'll just go ahead and create that file as well. I'm going to call it .env.local. You can call yours just .env. Inside of here, you're going to go ahead and create a value called SDK key. You'll also create a value called SDK secret. And this is going to be the space where you paste in those credentials that we got from the marketplace site. So I'll go ahead and just drop this into the chat. I want to point out that these are going to be wrapped inside of some quotations. And I'm just going to delete this file because I already have mine created right here. I'm just not showing it again to keep my private information private and not reveal my SDK key or secret. All right, so we've gone over server.js. The next page we're going to jump into is router.js. So inside router.js, again, I'm using this to work with all of any, right now it's only one post request, but in theory, any post or GET requests that are being made. So at the top, just pulling in Express again, making use of router from the Express package. And then on lines 5, you'll see that we have a variable called user controllers because we're pulling in a file, and that's we're pulling in the file usercontrollers.js. So you'll see on the side under server, we have the controllers folder, and then we also have usercontrollers.js. So that's where we're creating some middleware functionality. We'll jump into that in just a second, but I do want to point out that that's where this file is coming from. On lines 8 through 10, we're going to see that we have our what's happening with our endpoint generate. It's a post request. We have some empty space here because we are going to come back and add in another piece of metadata. And then we're also going to see what we're sending to the front end. So right now we see a value passed in res.locals.signature, and we're actually going to create that value once we jump onto usercontrollers.js. So right now we don't need to do anything to router.js. I just wanted to go over its structure so far. The next thing we're going to do is hop into usercontrollers.js. All right, so inside of usercontrollers.js, what we're going to do is, one, make use of some functionality that exists inside of our documentation. We'll go over that in just a second. But two, we also want to grab the information that we sent to the, information that we sent from the front end. So grab and make use of that. And then we're also going to grab our environment variables, which are going to be those credentials that we just saved inside of our .env file. So the first thing that we want to do is go ahead and destructure our request.body or our request object so that we can access what we sent over from the front end. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually going to do this on line 13. I'm going to go ahead and destructure my request body, grabbing my topic, password, name, and role type. So these are going to be the values that I'm grabbing from request.body, that request object that we sent from the front end back in home.js. So you should have a line that looks like this. If you're following along live, I'll go ahead and copy this into the chat so it's easy to just bring into your page. So we went ahead and grabbed these values by doing some object destructuring so that we can use them. Next thing we want to do is grab our SDK key. And then we'll see that on line 2, we've brought in our a package called .env. This allows us to read in environment variables. So to do this, we're going to write process.env.stk key. Now you want to make sure that you write in the variable name exactly how it was written inside the .env file. So we wrote it just like this, all capitals, an underscore between. So we're going to write it just in the same fashion on this page when we read it in. All right, so now the next thing we want to do is read in our SDK secret as well. And we're going to follow the same fashion as above. All right, so far we've added in, for me, lines 14 through 16. We've gotten access to topic, password, there should be a comma, name and role type by destructuring our object from the front end, accessing it with the request.body. We also read in our environment variable SDK key, and we also read in our environment variable SDK secret. All right, so now what we're going to go ahead and do is look at this functionality that we have happening down here. So I'm going to go ahead and jump out of VS Code quickly, and I just want to look at some of our documentation that exists on developers.zoom. So the functionality I have inside of VS Code, you'll notice is the same functionality that we have here on our authorization documentation page. So I'm just making use of what already exists for ease. Alan pointed out what the JavaScript RSA sign package is for. Kelly answered that question. And I also want to point out that it's also what's used in our documentation for creating a JWT signature as well. So you can access this code by going to developers.zoom.us/docs, and you can either navigate here by selecting Video SDK, or you can follow the link right here. This link is also at the end of our README document as well. And then on this page, you can simply copy the code and use that within your application. The only difference that we have, I'm going to jump back into our code quickly. The only difference that we have is that we're doing this on the back end, which again, you should always go ahead and generate your JOT token on the back end for security reasons. And because we're doing it on the back end, we do need to access variables from the front end with destructuring, and then just read in variables that are stored in the environment document for safety. So again, this is the same as what we see in documentation. We're generating our payload by using these values here. We created our initialization time right here, and we create our expiration time right here. We create that payload by using these different values. Then we're going to go ahead and stringify the payload and the header. We create our header right here on line 12. And then the last thing that we need to do, we want to save the output of signing our token. We want to save that output to the variable signature. And the variable signature was created on line 8. So we're going to move on to the last step that we have on usercontrollers.js. And this is going to be saving this signature that we just generated to an object that we can access on the front end. So we're accessing our res.locals object, and we're going to add in a value signature. And we're just going to save that we're going to save this created signature value into this object right here. So on my line 36, at the end, I have added in res.locals with an S dot signature, and I'm saving it right before I return next. Having done this, we're going to go ahead and move into the last part of step 1. And that's going to be to add in that middleware that we just created. So that is usercontrollers.generate token. We're going to go ahead and add that in to this endpoint so that it can go ahead and run through the generation of the token before it sends anything to the front end. All right, so your router.js should now look like this. We've added in just one thing to it, But that one thing is important because it allows us to generate our signature for it to be sent to the front end. res.locals.signature is what we just saved on usercontrollers.js. And now we are sending it to the front end. And this is going to be what comes out of that fetch call that we made in home.js. But now that we've completed this step, we are actually at the end of step 1. So what I'm going to do for my verification is just make sure I completed everything that I listed to be complete in step 1. So I'm going to jump into my README and just read off what's included in the step and make sure everything has been done. So we did go ahead and index.js. We added in the variable client so that we could use that. And we also passed it down with the provider method. Inside of app.js, we had the meeting arguments object, and we did render the home component. The rendered components are wrapped with the user context.provider method. And then we passed in the meeting arguments object as a value. We went into home.js and we created new variables, meeting arguments and client, and we did that with the use context hook. And we also created the function submit user data, and this makes a fetch request, it saves some variables, and it initializes our session. On the server side, we went over server.js. We also went over router.js. And inside of usercontrollers.js, we added in some functionality to generate our token. And then we also saved that signature that was generated so we could send it to the front end. And lastly, on router.js, we went ahead and added in usercontrollers.generate token so that that piece of middleware could be completed before we sent anything to the front end. So at this point, we're at the end of step 1. What you'll want to do is if at any point you feel as though you fell behind, you're going to go ahead and run the command. And let me copy this command into the chat. You're going to go ahead and run the command git checkout step_1. So if at any point you fell behind, you can catch up to where we are before we move into the next step. So now what we're going to go ahead and do is move on to the next step. I'll just quickly preview what step 2 is going to do. We're going to create and fill out a file called session.js in our home folder. And then we're going to go ahead and add that to app.js so that it is a rendered component. So let's go ahead and take care of that. I'm going to close out the files I no longer need. So I'm just closing out any server-side files. I'm going to close out global context as well. And then I see there is an error here. Let me just look and see what this is. Return. Missing a backslash. Not right there. All right, so now we're good to go. All right, so moving on. Now what we're going to do, like I just mentioned, is create that session.js file. So I'm going to go ahead and just right-click my home folder. I'm going to create a new file. And make sure I'm in the window. This is going to be called session.js. All right, so inside of session.js, we're going to go ahead and create functionality to join and leave our session. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy in some boilerplate code, which is going to include my imports. Once I copy this in, if you're following along live, I will also send this in the chat. So you can go ahead and just paste all these imports to the top of session.js. And now the next thing I'm going to do is just create my functional component. Ooh, I will fix this. I'm also going to add in my return statement. And then I am going to export this file so that I don't forget to do it at the end. So right now, session.js should look like this with some boilerplate code, and we're going to go ahead and fill out the functionality and UI in the next steps. All right, so now we need to go ahead and access some variables that were created inside other pages. The first one's going to be meeting args. Again, meeting args was created inside of app.js. And then we also, inside of home.js, added some values. Those values we added were the inputted username, the inputted password, and our generated signature. So I'm grabbing this by using the use context hook. I'm going to pass in my user context. And the next set of variables that I want to grab a hold of are going to be the variables from my meeting arguments object. So I'm going to, again, make use of object destructuring so that's a little easier to access these variables. So I'm going to grab topic. signature, name, and password. And I'm grabbing them from my meeting args object. Next, I am going to grab my client using the use context hook. And then we're going to pass in client context. So far, session.js should have these 3 variables, well, 3+, these variables added in. And then quickly, I do just want to point out on line 5, we see we have an import from something called ANTD. So this, as mentioned in our README, this project is making use of the UI library Ant Design. So we're just pulling in something from Ant Design on this line, and we're going to make use of that later on. But just wanted to point it out so there are no questions about what our imports are. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and add in that last variable. Again, we're making use of the navigate, the use navigate hook. And these are the variables that we'll need on this page. For readability, add in some spaces. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and create 2 functions. The first is going to be a function called join session. And inside of this function, we're going to join the session. We've already initialized it. We did that on home.js. And now that we've initialized, if the initialization is successful, we're able to join the session. So this is going to be an asynchronous function. I'll add in my first keyword. The next thing I'm going to do is call the join function on my client. And I want to pass in 4 arguments that are needed, and they do need to be passed in the specific order. So we have topic first, signature, name, and password. All right, so with this, we're going to use a try catch block. So inside of our try block, if the promise resolves successfully, we're going to go ahead, again, a console log that is not absolutely necessary. I'm using it just for my assurance. I'll console log join successful. Then what I'm going to go ahead and do is create a variable called stream. So stream is going to gain access to the media stream that we're pulling from our client. So this is going to be video, audio. We're going to gain access to it by calling the get media stream function. Now, we're not going to make use of stream in this project today or in this workshop today, but I do just want to show us what it looks like to initialize or to call the function and gain access to the media stream. And that's going to be the same thing for our next value, which is our user ID. We're not making use of this right now, but again, we're just running through what it looks like to grab these variables. So for the user ID, we're going to call a function called get current user info. And then inside of that object, we're going to access the user ID property. So at this point, your join session function should include the client.join function, and the try block should look like this. Next thing we're going to do is create our catch block if we have any errors. And we'll just send that error to the console. All right. So this is what it should look like so far. And then if you did check out, this line may look a little different. You may have a longer error message. If you do, that's fine. For demonstration purposes, we're just going to leave it as the error that we receive. All right, so this is the end of our join session function. We're joining our session, passing in the arguments, topic, signature, name, and password in that order. We got those variables by doing some object destructuring on line 10. Now we're going to go ahead and create a function called end session that is much more straightforward. So end session is actually just going to be how we leave our session. So we're going to call the function leave. And then we are going to navigate to our homepage. So again, making use of that use navigate hook. And we're just going to push the user. Once they leave the session, we're going to push them back to the homepage. And again, that homepage is where they log in. All right, so we've created our end session function and we've created our join session function. All right, so after we've created our end session function, the next thing we want to do, we're going to jump into our return statement, and we're going to create some buttons so that the user can actually click a button to join the session and click a button to leave the session. So inside of our return, let's go ahead and just make a div. All right, inside of here, we're going to add our first button, and we're going to add an on-click tag for this. So on-click, what we're going to do is call the function join session. And then this button is going to be called join session. And then we'll close this tag. So inside of your return statement, so far, it should look like this. We have a div, and inside of the div, we have a button. The button joins our session. It actually invokes that function when it's clicked. And now we'll do the same thing. We're going to go ahead and create a function to leave our session, which is going to call the function end session. And then we'll close out this button tag as well. So right now, inside of your return statement, it should look like this. If you're following along live, I'll copy it into the chat. All right, and there we go. We have our buttons that we can leave and we can join a session. The next thing that we want to do is go ahead and make sure that this is being rendered. Our session page is a rendered component so that we can access it with our paths. So what we're going to go ahead and do is move back into our app.js file. And similar to how we passed in the home component, we're going to do the same thing by creating a route and passing in our session component. So for the path name for this is going to be /session. And then our element is going to be the session component, which you'll see has been imported for us on line 5. This should be a capital S. All right, so app.js should now look like this. We'll have another line added. For me, that's line 22. We went ahead and added in our session component, so that is rendered. All right, and let's just go ahead and jump back into session.js and do a quick review of what we added in here. So inside of session.js, we had those imports at the top. Then we went ahead and inside of our functional component, we grabbed some variables that we need to make use of. We created a function called join session. This joins our session. It has a try catch block. We create the variable stream and user ID. We're not making use of them in this workshop, but you will see them being used in future workshops. Then we went ahead and consoled our error if we did have one, if the promise did not resolve successfully. We also create a function called end session. This is just going to simply leave the session and push the user back to the home page. And then we added in some very simple UI, a button to join and a button to end the session. So this is actually the end of step 2. Step 2 was a lot more succinct than step 1. And I'm going to do the same thing I did before, jump into my README and make sure I've done all that I set out to do for this step. So variables inside of the functional component session, we did add these in. We did go ahead and add the join session function, create stream and user ID, added end session, added our buttons, and app.js does now additionally render the session component. And we have the path /session. So we're going to do the same thing here. If you fell behind in any of these steps, you can go ahead and run the command git checkout step 2, and then you'll be caught up to where we are before we move on to the last step. We're going to go ahead and move on to step 3. And in step 3, we are just going to add in an event listener that's going to notify us when a user has joined the session. And so now let's go ahead and jump into session.js and do so. So inside of session.js, we're working with the event listener, but we're only going to add in one for today. We will see more of these used in future workshops. So what we're going to do is call client.on. And the name of this event is going to be user added. And then what we're going to do is call the function user joined. Now we haven't created that function yet. I did just want us to write the event listener first. But the next step is going to be to create the user join function. So on my line 30 of session.js, right after end session, I went ahead and wrote this in. And now right above this, I'm going to go ahead and create our user join function. All right, so inside of user join, what we're going to do is take advantage of the message import that we have from Ant Design. And this just allows us to broadcast a message on the page so the user can see. So this is we're going to do message.success. This is just simple. It just gives a message that is successful. So it's going to be a green check mark instead of a red X. That's what the .success means. And the message is going to be user has joined. All right, that's what this should look like. And then we could, if you are looking and you push to get, or you checked out to get checkout step 2, you may have another function called user left. Right now, we're not making use of that, so I'm not going to go ahead and add that in. If you have it in your code, it's not going to break anything, but just for today, I'm not going to go ahead and add that in. We're only going to focus on user joined. All right, so saving this page, what's going to happen now is when a user joins the session, this event listener is going to fire, and it's going to go ahead and call the function user joined. And user joined is just going to go ahead and broadcast a message that the user has joined the session. And that's the end of step 3. Step 3 was very short. So at the end of this step, now I'm just jumping back into my README. What we should have done is added the event listener and added the function user join to session.js. So now that we have done this, we have come to the end of our application, or the end of the application for this workshop. In this application, again, we initialized a session, we joined a session, and we were able to access our client throughout our application. So now we're going to go ahead and open this up and see what it looks like. So I'm just going to go ahead and check out. I'm going to check out to my master branch where the project is complete. Don't need to save my changes. I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and delete some things just because I don't need to save these changes. Let's go ahead and delete this. Cool. All right, and now I'm going to go ahead and run my application so that we can see what it looks like. So first thing I need to do is jump into my server terminal, and I'm going to start my server. And if you're following along with me and running your application as well, you can go ahead and save all your changes, stay on the branch that you were on. You'll jump into your server, and you'll just run node server to start your server. And I'm also going to, now I'm going to jump into my client in a separate terminal, and I am going to run npm start to start the front end of my project. All right, it's just loading. And let me pull this in so that you all can see it. Give me 1 second. All right, and then if someone, Michael or Kelly, if you could just confirm that you're seeing my application window.
I am, and we are all on pins and needles.
Oh my gosh, the pressure. All right.
This is so exciting.
So I'm just gonna go ahead and type in a username, type in a password, submit. So it's very plain, but right now we can see we have our join session or our leave session button. When I click join session, we're going to get a message at the top in just a second. User has joined. And then when I leave my session, this called client.leave, we left the session and we are being pushed back to our login page. So very simple for now, but we know how to get started with the Video SDK. So again, we saw how to grab credentials, initialize, and join a session. And in next workshops, we will see how to go ahead and manage video and audio. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen and show us our last call to action, where we will just, give me 1 second so I can find that. And we'll just talk about some next steps for you all. So that is the end of the building portion of our workshop. Some next step for you all. Again, I have mentioned future workshops many times, so make sure to look out for the next workshop registration link that'll be sent in an email, and be sure to sign up. And if you have any questions when you are building with the Video SDK, be sure to find us on the developer forum at devforum.zoom.us. that is the end of our workshop, and we thank you all so much for joining us.